Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. The heavy, lead-lined door of Sector 4 groaned in severe protest as Dominic hauled the massive iron wheel counterclockwise. He had fully expected the violent hiss of a ruptured pressure valve or the dull, structural thud of a collapsed support strut. Instead, his halogen flashlight cut through the stale subterranean darkness to reveal a woman suspended in midair. She was encased in a fluid, luminescent biomechanical armor that pulsed with an ethereal blue light. And she was dangling completely upside down, violently swatting at the empty space around her like an angry, inverted turtle. Dominic Brockman was 45 years old, though his eyes carried the heavy, exhausted weight of a man who had lived twice as long and seen far too much. He was the sole engineer and caretaker of the Mojave Deep Vault, an immense subterranean fortress buried precisely 2 miles beneath the scorched sands of the Nevada desert. The vault was a colossal repository, a concrete and titanium tomb designed to preserve the most critical agricultural seeds and raw digital data of human history. For Dominic, it was the perfect place to hide. The crushing silence of the deep earth acted as a heavy, comforting blanket that smothered the chaotic, violent memories of the surface world he had deliberately left behind. Down here, there were no unpredictable variables. There were only pressure gauges, climate controls, and the rhythmic, predictable hum of industrial diesel generators. At least, that was the absolute truth until tonight. He had been sitting in his dimly lit control room, nursing a bitter mug of black coffee, when the rhythmic scratching of the archaic seismic sensor caught his immediate attention. Dominic vastly preferred the old analog systems. They did not glitch, they did not require software updates, and they absolutely could not be hacked. The brass arm of the seismograph had danced erratically, its ink-tipped needle violently scratching a jagged mountain range across the rotating drum of graph paper. The tremor was highly localized, pinpointed perfectly in Sector 4. That particular wing of the vault was a sealed mausoleum containing 20th-century technological relics, massive rusted hulks of early industrial machinery that had long since been decommissioned and utterly forgotten by the world above. Dominic had stared at the fresh ink bleeding into the paper. It was clearly not an earthquake. Tectonic shifts rolled through the bedrock. This was a sharp, aggressive puncture, a structural subsidence, he had reasoned, or perhaps a severe atmospheric pressure leak that had finally caused one of the old bulkheads to buckle under the tremendous weight of the earth. He did not panic. Panic was an emotion he had surgically excised from his mind years ago. He calmly set his coffee mug down on the steel console, grabbed his heavy canvas tool belt, and retrieved his absolute favorite piece of equipment. It was a massive, drop-forged carbon steel wrench, nearly 3 feet long, heavy enough to crack a man's skull or torque a seized industrial bolt. With the wrench resting casually on his right shoulder and a high-lumen halogen flashlight gripped tightly in his left hand, Dominic began the long, echoing walk down the concrete corridors. The air grew significantly colder and staler the deeper he ventured. The comforting hum of the main generators faded into a thick, oppressive silence, broken only by the steady, methodical crunch of his steel-toed boots against the grated floor. When he finally reached the reinforced bulkheads of the sector, the exterior pressure dials read perfectly normal. No atmospheric leaks, no structural breaches. Nothing made logical sense. Which brought him to the exact moment he hauled the door open and shined his light into the cavernous storage bay. He stood perfectly still, his rugged face entirely devoid of surprise, though his analytical mind was desperately struggling to process the absolute absurdity of the scene before him. There was no collapsed ceiling. There was no ruptured water main. There was only the woman. Her armor was a marvel of impossible engineering, a seamless second skin of shifting, liquid metal that glowed with a soft, otherworldly luminescence. Yet, for all its undeniable sophistication, the futuristic suit was currently betraying her in the most humiliating way technically possible. She was plastered tight against the underside of an ancient electromagnetic industrial crane. The crane was a hulking, rusted relic from a bygone era of heavy manufacturing, built around a massive iron core that generated a crude but devastatingly powerful magnetic field. The advanced biomaterials of her suit were entirely at the absolute mercy of the primitive, overwhelming magnetism. The crane held her securely by her back, leaving her arms and legs completely free but utterly useless. She was thrashing wildly, her limbs swimming through the empty air in a frantic, undignified display of royal fury. Dominic leaned casually against the heavy steel doorframe, resting the heavy head of his carbon steel wrench against the concrete floor. He flicked his halogen beam directly into her eyes. She hissed, raising a heavily armored forearm to shield her face. "Lower your primitive light weapon, you filthy indigenous creature." Her voice echoed sharply through the cavernous room. It was a commanding tone, dripping with the absolute arrogance of royalty, perfectly translated through whatever advanced auditory technology she wore. "I am Princess Kaelin of the Golden Empire. You have exactly 10 seconds to deactivate this gravity reversal snare, or I will signal my vanguard to vaporize this pathetic mudball you call a planet." Dominic blinked slowly. He looked at the rusted crane, then looked back at the glowing, furious woman suspended in midair. He did not say a single word. He simply walked over to the thick, dust-covered wall panel nearby. His heavy boots echoed methodically on the concrete. He reached out and wrapped his calloused hand around the massive, industrial-grade power plug connecting the old crane to the vault's rudimentary electrical grid. With a sharp, indifferent yank, he pulled the plug directly from the socket. The deep, vibrating hum of the electromagnet instantly died. Gravity, cold and completely unforgiving, immediately reasserted its dominance over the advanced biomechanical armor. Princess Kaelin dropped like a stone. She plummeted 15 feet and landed with an undignified, muffled thud directly into a massive pile of decaying, yellowed foam mattresses that had been discarded decades ago. A thick cloud of stale dust exploded into the air, completely swallowing her majestic, glowing form. Dominic strolled over to the edge of the foam pile, his expression remaining completely blank. He reached into his heavy coat pocket and pulled out his battered steel thermos. He unscrewed the cap, poured a small measure of warm, pitch-black coffee, and held it out toward the cloud of dust where the mighty alien royal was currently coughing violently and struggling to untangle herself from the rotten bedding. "Welcome to the basement, Your Highness," Dominic said, his voice a dry, gravelly monotone that carried not a single trace of awe or intimidation. "You spilled my cup." Kaelin swatted the battered steel thermos away. The hot, dark liquid splashed uselessly against the cold concrete floor. She did not yell. She did not issue another royal decree. The arrogant, untouchable facade completely crumbled away, replaced instantly by a bitter, hollow exhaustion that made her look incredibly small. "I am not on a diplomatic mission," she choked out, her voice completely stripped of its commanding synthetic echo. She slumped against the pile of decayed foam, pulling her knees tight against her chest. "My transit matrix was intentionally sabotaged. The navigation coordinates were maliciously corrupted before I even stepped onto the platform." She looked up at the rusted, arching ceiling of the cavernous vault. "It was my uncle. He wants the imperial throne, and he knows I am the only legitimate heir. The imperial vanguard, the very elite soldiers sworn by blood oath to protect my lineage, are actively hunting me down right now to ensure absolutely no witnesses survive." Before Dominic could offer a dry, sarcastic reply regarding her family dynamics. The ethereal blue luminescence of her biomechanical suit violently flickered. It sparked with a sharp hiss, and then suddenly shifted into a harsh, blinding crimson. A high-pitched, rhythmic shrieking emitted directly from the heavy collarbone plating, echoing shrilly across the empty sector. Kaylin stared down at her chest in absolute horror. "It is not a protective shell," she whispered, her eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing terror. "He overrode the firmware. It is a localized targeting beacon. They know exactly where I am." A sound, like the tearing of the sky itself, erupted from directly above them. The solid concrete floor violently heaved, throwing them both entirely off balance. Dominic instinctively grabbed the heavy iron frame of the bulkhead door to steady himself. The subterranean vault was originally designed to withstand a direct thermonuclear impact on the surface, but the noise currently echoing through the deep bedrock was entirely different. It was a high-frequency, teeth-grinding whine that seemed to rattle the very marrow inside their bones. "They are not landing their ships," Kaylin shouted over the deafening, unnatural roar. "They are using molecular resonance drills. They are dissolving the tectonic plates to reach me." 2 miles of solid granite, shale, and heavily reinforced titanium-laced concrete were being systematically atomized. A blinding, searing pillar of pure white light punched directly through the vaulted ceiling of Sector 4. Molten slag, ash, and vaporized rock showered the dark room like a localized meteor strike, illuminating the forgotten industrial machinery in flashes of terrifying brilliance. From the glaring, jagged hole in the ceiling, a sleek, matte black canister plummeted into the cavernous bay. It struck the ground with a massive, echoing crash. But instead of detonating, it smoothly blossomed open like a mechanical lotus flower. A thick, shimmering silver mist began to pour relentlessly from the canister. It did not behave like smoke. It moved with a terrifying, fluid intelligence, rolling across the floor in a highly coordinated, unified wave. "Silica nanobots!" Kaylin screamed, scrambling backward over the ruined bedding, her eyes locked on the approaching tide. "They consume all organic matter and harness synthetic energy grids to multiply. Run!" She threw her hands forward in a desperate, defensive gesture, and the crimson suit projected a crackling, convex shield of pure blue plasma. The silver mist rushed forward and crashed violently against the energy barrier. However, instead of being repelled or incinerated, the microscopic machines began to glow furiously, eagerly feeding on the raw thermal and electrical output. Within 3 agonizing seconds, the indestructible, high-tech plasma shield flickered, destabilized, and completely collapsed into a shower of useless, dying sparks. The nanobot swarm immediately surged forward, multiplying exponentially, hungry for the royal flesh trapped beneath the armor. Dominic did not run. He did not draw an energy pistol or ignite a laser blade. He simply pivoted on his heel, grabbed the heavy, red industrial-grade carbon dioxide fire extinguisher mounted on the adjacent concrete pillar, and ripped the metal safety pin out with his teeth. He stepped directly in front of the terrified princess. As the silver wave reared up to engulf them entirely, Dominic squeezed the iron trigger with brutal force. A massive, roaring cloud of supercooled white fog blasted out of the heavy rubber nozzle. The ambient temperature plunged drastically in a fraction of a second. The silica nanobots were absolute marvels of quantum engineering, entirely capable of devouring nuclear radiation and surviving concentrated laser fire. But they possessed absolutely zero defense against an extreme, sudden drop in physical temperature. The severe freezing shock immediately locked their microscopic mechanical joints. The terrifying silver wave instantly turned into a brittle, dull gray crust. As the heavy, relentless blast of freezing carbon dioxide continued to pummel them, the frozen nanobots shattered into billions of useless, inert flakes of dead metal, sweeping across the floor like dirty, metallic snow. Dominic tossed the empty red cylinder aside. It clattered loudly against the frozen flakes. "Take off the suit," he ordered, his voice cutting through the ringing silence like a sharp whip. Kaylin stared at him, still hyperventilating, her chest heaving against the glowing red armor. "Without the armor, I am completely defenseless." "With the armor, you are a glowing red bullseye," Dominic fired back, striding aggressively toward her. "Take it off right now, or I will use my wrench and pry it off your body myself." Realizing the brutal, undeniable logic of his demand, she frantically pressed a sequence of physical emergency releases hidden near her collar. The crimson suit hissed loudly, depressurized, and fell away from her body in heavy, dead metallic slabs. She stood shivering in a thin, dark gray woven undersuit. Dominic immediately stripped off his thick, heavily grease-stained canvas work coat and threw it roughly at her chest. "Put this on. The heavy fabric will mask your thermal signature." He grabbed his heavy carbon steel wrench, sprinted to the far wall, and violently smashed the solid metal head against the locking mechanism of a low-lying ventilation grate. The rusted iron cover popped loose with a sharp crack and clattered to the floor. He grabbed Kaylin by the shoulder and shoved her roughly toward the dark, narrow, rectangular opening. "Get inside," Dominic commanded, his eyes scanning the gaping hole in the ceiling, where more stealth ships were undoubtedly waiting to drop their lethal payload. Kaylin crawled into the cramped, pitch-black shaft, the heavy smell of ozone, dry dust, and ancient rust immediately assaulting her senses. Dominic slid in, right behind her, dragging the heavy iron grate back into place, just as a second wave of silver mist began to pour from the ceiling breach. "Listen to me very carefully," Dominic whispered. His face was barely an inch from hers in the suffocating, total darkness, but his voice was chillingly calm. "Those bugs out there are entirely blind. They do not use optical sensors or thermal imaging. They are biologically programmed to hunt the specific chemical and acoustic markers of fear. They track cortisol spikes, adrenaline surges, and the acoustic vibrations of a pounding chest cavity." Kaylin swallowed hard, feeling her own pulse hammering frantically against her ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. "We have to move through these service tunnels to reach the lower levels," Dominic instructed, his deadpan tone completely devoid of the panic that was actively consuming her mind. "But if your heart rate goes over 90 beats per minute, they will hear it echoing through the metal, and they will flood this entire shaft. You need to calm down, right this exact second, or we are both going to die terribly in this pipe." The claustrophobic darkness pressed in heavily on them. Above, the metallic screeching of the assassin vanguard echoed violently through the breached vault. Kaylin closed her eyes, fighting desperately against the rising tide of pure terror, forcing her racing heart into a steady, agonizingly slow rhythm. The descent felt like crawling straight into the throat of a dying beast. They slipped out of the narrow ventilation network and dropped heavily onto the graded catwalks of level Sub-Zero. This was the geothermal processing sector, the absolute lowest point of the facility, sitting directly above the churning magma currents of the Earth's mantle. The heat down here was instantly suffocating, wrapping around them like a thick, wet wool blanket. The ambient temperature hovered around 130 degrees Fahrenheit, a blistering inferno that caused the heavy air itself to ripple and distort in violent optical waves. Dominic had chosen this exact route with cold, calculated precision. The massive, boiling pipes that snaked along the concrete walls radiated such extreme thermal energy that they completely washed out the entire sector. Any advanced infrared tracking or biological heat sensors the assassins employed would be utterly blinded by the overwhelming ambient radiation. Down here, the two fugitives were completely invisible to thermal optics. However, the extreme environment was pushing Kaylin to the absolute brink of a psychological collapse. Deprived of her neural interface and the cooling systems of her armor, she stumbled clumsily along the rusted metal grating, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. For her entire life, her sensory input had been perfectly curated by a highly advanced artificial intelligence. She was completely accustomed to seeing the physical world through complex probability matrices, instant threat detection algorithms, and predictive environmental mapping. Without her technological augments, she felt entirely blind, deaf, and terrifyingly vulnerable. The suffocating darkness and the roaring hiss of the subterranean machinery violently pressed against her eardrums, completely disorienting her royal senses. Dominic, by stark contrast, moved through the treacherous, boiling labyrinth with the relaxed, confident grace of a man walking through his own living room. He did not need a glowing holographic map or a synthetic voice feeding him turn-by-turn directions. He carried his heavy carbon steel wrench and struck it rhythmically against the sprawling network of thick iron pipes. A sharp, clear clink would ring out through the dark. Dominic would pause, tilting his head slightly to catch the returning reverberation. He was reading the structural integrity of the facility through pure acoustic feedback, navigating the pitch-black maze by analyzing how the sound waves traveled through empty corridors, dead ends, and pressurized fluid lines. It was a masterful, primitive echolocation that no quantum algorithm could ever replicate. High above them, the heavy steel access hatches groaned loudly and finally yielded. The vanguard had arrived. 3 elite Imperial assassins dropped onto the upper catwalks, with terrifying, absolute silence. Their boots did not make a single metallic clatter as they hit the iron grates. They wore sleek, obsidian-black combat suits, constructed from tightly woven, impact-resistant polymers. But their most dangerous asset covered the top half of their faces. They were equipped with quantum acoustic amplification visors, highly sensitive neurological headsets designed to capture and isolate microscopic auditory disturbances across vast distances. With those visors engaged, the assassins could effortlessly hear the microscopic friction of fabric rubbing against skin, or the terrified, erratic thumping of a human heart from over a mile away. Dominic raised a heavily calloused hand, signaling Kalen to stop immediately. He pointed down toward a massive, heavily rusted water main that ran parallel to a lower access tunnel. The ambient noise of the bubbling geothermal fluid was exceptionally loud here. But Dominic knew the sophisticated quantum filters of the enemy would eventually isolate the sound of their ragged breathing. He needed a highly convincing decoy. He needed to manipulate their overwhelming technological superiority entirely against them. He guided Kalen behind a thick concrete support pillar and knelt beside an abandoned, rotting maintenance workbench. His rough hands rummaged blindly through a decaying wooden drawer until his fingers brushed against a specific, forgotten artifact. It was an old, wooden mechanical metronome, likely brought down decades ago by an engineer who practiced musical timing during long, isolated shifts. Dominic blew the thick layer of dust off the pyramidal device. He gripped the small brass winding key and turned it with slow, deliberate precision. He wound the heavy internal spring tight, then carefully adjusted the sliding metal weight on the swinging pendulum arm. He set the exact mechanical tempo to 72 beats per minute. With extreme caution, Dominic placed the wooden box flush against the hollow iron acoustic pipe. He released the pendulum. Tick, tick, tick. The heavy, rhythmic sound aggressively amplified inside the empty metal cylinder, echoing far down the corridor with the exact cadence and deep resonance of a calm, steady, biological human heartbeat. Dominic grabbed Kalen by the shoulder and pulled her backward into the deep shadows beneath the catwalk, stopping directly next to a massive, circular iron lock valve that controlled the pressure of a primary geothermal steam line. High above, the highly tuned quantum headsets of the Vanguard instantly registered the rhythmic acoustic pulse. The artificial intelligence embedded in their visors aggressively filtered out the ambient roaring of the magma pipes, locking entirely onto the isolated 72 beats per minute. Completely believing they had cornered their terrified prey, trying to hide behind the machinery. The three assassins moved forward. They crept down the metal stairs, their energy weapons drawn, moving with the synchronized fluid lethality of apex predators closing in for a quiet execution. They formed a tight tactical triangle as they approached the rusted pipe, their visors glowing with a faint, predatory violet hue in the dark. They aimed their subatomic disruptors at the dark space behind the pipe, fully expecting to find the rogue princess and the indigenous human cowering in terror. Instead, they found a small wooden box, happily ticking away. Before the highly advanced combat algorithms in their helmets could process the sheer absurdity of the decoy. Dominic wrapped both of his hands tightly around the rusted iron wheel of the geothermal valve. He planted his heavy boots firmly against the concrete wall for structural leverage and pulled with every single ounce of physical strength he possessed. The ancient metal shrieked in violent protest, but the heavy interior gears finally gave way. Dominic violently spun the wheel wide open. A catastrophic eruption of superheated, high-pressure steam blasted out of the release vent with the deafening roar of a launching rocket. Several thousand pounds of pressure per square inch violently vented directly into the narrow corridor. The result was absolute, instantaneous devastation for the highly advanced strike team. The dense, boiling cloud of moisture completely flooded their optical sensors. The quantum visors, intricately designed to precisely calculate the minute bending of light and track subatomic movement, were completely overwhelmed and blinded by the chaotic, swirling mass of superheated water droplets. The extreme, sudden spike in physical temperature instantly melted and fused the delicate microcircuitry inside their headsets. But the acoustic damage was far more lethal. The deafening, physical roar of the violently pressurized steam aggressively overloaded their highly sensitive audio amplifiers, blasting a localized sonic shockwave directly into their eardrums. The assassins screamed in pure agony, completely blinded and deafened by the crude, brutal assault, stripped instantly of their immense technological advantages, their rigorous military discipline completely shattered into sheer, unadulterated panic. Believing they were being actively ambushed from all sides, they blindly pulled the triggers of their subatomic disruptors. Blinding flashes of lethal purple energy ricocheted wildly through the steam-filled corridor. The vanguard assassins, entirely disoriented by the brutal sensory overload, violently gunned each other down in the blinding white fog. Heavy bodies clad in obsidian armor crashed heavily against the metal grates, completely destroyed by their own elite weaponry. From the safety of the dark alcove, Kaylin watched the chaotic slaughter unfold in absolute, stunned silence. Her brilliant mind struggled to fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of what she had just witnessed. The Vanguard was the most feared military force in the known galaxy. Their weapons could calculate the orbital trajectory of a moon, and their armor could easily withstand the freezing vacuum of deep space. Yet, they had just been entirely eradicated by a rusted iron wheel, a blast of hot water, and a wooden box that ticked. They were completely blind to the crude, undeniable, physical laws of Earth. She looked down at the sleek, depleted laser pistol she still clutched tightly in her hand. It was an elegant weapon, a true pinnacle of Imperial engineering, and right now, it was utterly, completely useless. She slowly opened her fingers and let the expensive piece of dead technology clatter loudly onto the metal floor. Her eyes shifted toward a heavy, solid iron crowbar resting against the brick maintenance wall. Kaylin stepped forward, reached out, and wrapped her hands tightly around the cold, heavy metal. It possessed no probability matrix. It required no battery charge. It was simply a lever, heavily reliant on pure physical force and leverage. She lifted it, feeling its brutal, honest weight, and turned back to Dominic with a fierce, newly ignited fire burning intensely in her eyes. The heavy iron door sealed shut behind them, cutting off the hissing remnants of the ruined steam corridor. They collapsed into a natural cavern, situated just beyond the reinforced concrete perimeter of the vault. It was a sprawling, subterranean pocket, completely lined with jagged, naturally formed salt crystals. The pale minerals caught the faint, dying amber light of Dominic's emergency flare, casting long, fractured shadows across the uneven stone floor. Dominic leaned heavily against a massive salt pillar. He hissed through clenched teeth, his right hand shaking violently. The brutal friction of the rusted iron valve, combined with the searing blast of high-pressure vapor, had left his palm blistered and raw. Kaylin did not hesitate. She dropped her heavy iron crowbar, knelt beside him, and gripped the thick hem of her dark, gray woven undersuit. With a sharp, violent pull, she tore a long strip of the fabric free. She took his injured hand with surprising gentleness, her glowing eyes reflecting the flickering amber light, and began to carefully wrap the makeshift bandage around his scorched skin. "You saved my life," Kaylin whispered softly, pulling the fabric taut. The arrogant royalty was completely gone, replaced by a profound, heavy sorrow. "But you do not truly understand what you are protecting. My people are not the benevolent cosmic explorers our propaganda claims." Dominic watched her methodically tie the knot. He leaned his head back against the cold stone. "I figured that out when they sent an elite kill squad to vaporize you. It is worse than a simple usurpation of the throne," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. She sat back on her heels, staring into the dying light of the flare. "The Golden Empire is a parasite. We do not conquer weaker civilizations with massive armadas or orbital bombardments. We assimilate them. We infiltrate their digital networks, rewrite their fundamental technology, and turn their own automated infrastructure against them. We enslave entire star systems by simply reprogramming their reliance on convenience." She reached around to the back of her neck, tracing a long, raised scar that ran directly down her upper spine. "My uncle ordered the systematic eradication of 3 entire agricultural worlds to secure his power base. He wiped the digital archives perfectly. But he could not wipe this. Embedded right here, fused directly into my spinal column, is a primitive, unhackable memory crystal. It contains the raw, analog audio recordings of his genocidal commands. It is the only physical proof of his treason. That is why I cannot be allowed to survive." The cavern fell into a deep, heavy silence. The only sound was the distant, muffled churning of the magma currents thousands of feet below them. Dominic stared at his bandaged hand for a long, quiet moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of its usual dry sarcasm. "I know exactly what automated slaughter looks like." Kaylin looked up, genuinely surprised by the raw pain bleeding through his stoic exterior. 20 years ago, Dominic began, his eyes fixed on the cavern ceiling. The surface world tore itself apart. It was not a war of ideologies. It was a corporate resource conflict. But nobody sent soldiers. They sent autonomous drone swarms. They used predictive combat algorithms. The machines calculated that destroying a residential sector was mathematically necessary to eliminate a nearby supply chain. He paused, his jaw tightening. "My wife and my daughter were in that sector. The people who pushed the button never even saw their faces. They just looked at a flashing red percentage on a digital screen and authorized the strike." He turned his head to look directly into her eyes. "The more advanced the technology becomes, the easier it is for people to completely erase their own humanity. That is exactly why I buried myself 2 miles underground. I wanted to live in a place where I could touch every single gear, turn every single valve, and know exactly what the machine was doing." Kaylin looked around the cavern, a profound realization slowly washing over her. "Your trauma became your fortress. The Vanguard relies entirely on algorithmic prediction and digital synchronization. Earth is so incredibly backward, so completely disconnected from the cosmic quantum network, that our weapons literally do not know how to process your reality. Your primitive world is the ultimate armor. Before Dominic could reply, a catastrophic tremor violently shook the cavern. This was not the localized drilling from before. The entire structural foundation of the vault screamed. Massive chunks of salt crystal sheared off the ceiling and crashed aggressively onto the stone floor, shattering into thousands of jagged splinters. Kaylin grabbed Dominic's shoulder to steady herself, her eyes wide with sudden dread. "The commander, he realizes he cannot track us in this thermal distortion. He has stopped searching." Dominic pushed himself off the wall, gripping his heavy wrench tightly with his good hand. "What did he do?" "He dropped a core resonator into the primary magma vent," Kaylin shouted over the deafening rumble of the collapsing Earth. "It is a seismic destabilizer. It will intentionally trigger a massive localized volcanic eruption. He is going to melt this entire subterranean facility and bury the evidence forever. We have less than 20 minutes before the magma breaches the lower bulkheads." Dominic looked at the heavy iron door they had just come through, then looked down at his bandaged hand. The instinct to run, to hide deeper in the dark, had kept him alive for 2 decades. But there was nowhere left to hide. The isolation was over. "We are not running anymore," Dominic stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He pointed his wrench back toward the main concrete facility. "We are going to the analog communications room. It is the architectural heart of this entire bunker." Kaylin grabbed her solid iron crowbar from the ground. "To send a distress signal." "No," Dominic replied, turning toward the heavy iron door with a cold, terrifying determination. "To build a very big hammer." The underground facility was actively dying around them. The relentless, deep earth vibrations triggered by the core resonator sent violent, rolling shockwaves through the heavy concrete corridors. Thick dust rained from the cracking ceiling, and the emergency strobe lights painted the crumbling walls in frantic, flashing amber. Kaylin and Dominic sprinted shoulder to shoulder, abandoning stealth entirely as the rapidly expanding magma pocket far below threatened to swallow the entire facility within a matter of minutes. They finally breached the heavy blast doors of the analog communications room. It was a staggering architectural marvel, entirely distinct from the utilitarian corridors of the subterranean vault. Built during the height of the 1950s, the entire chamber was constructed as a colossal, perfect acoustic parabola. Towering, heavily oxidized shortwave radio antennas stretched upward like a forest of dead iron trees, permanently wired to massive banks of archaic vacuum tubes and manual switchboards. Standing dead center in the cavernous room, completely unfazed by the collapsing structure, was the Vanguard commander. He did not wear the matte black stealth polymer of his subordinates. His imposing frame was encased entirely in a seamless, interlocking matrix of synthetic crystalline armor. The microcircuitry within the crystalline structure pulsed with an arrogant, shifting violet energy, rendering him effectively invulnerable to kinetic impact, extreme thermal displacement, and directed energy fire. The commander did not draw his weapon immediately. He slowly turned his helmeted head, his voice booming through the parabolic chamber with terrifying, synthetic clarity. "You dragged yourself to a dead radio tower to scream for help into an empty sky, a rather pathetic end for the golden lineage." Kaylin stepped aggressively to the forefront, purposefully placing herself between the commander and the heavy broadcast console. She dropped her solid iron crowbar onto the metal grating with a loud, resounding clatter. "I am not here to broadcast a distress signal," Kaylin declared, her voice trembling just enough to effectively sell the utter desperation of a defeated royal. She raised her empty hands in the air, tilting her chin upward in an act of absolute surrender. "You want the memory crystal embedded in my spine. If you try to extract it from my corpse, the biometric failsafe will instantly corrupt the data. Let me perform the surgical extraction myself. I will give you the undamaged proof of the Emperor's treason, but you must let the human engineer walk away." The commander let out a low, mechanized laugh that fiercely rattled the loose overhead fixtures. Your primitive empathy is a fatal design flaw, Princess. This indigenous engineer is already dead. In fact, this entire planet is already dead. Once I secure the crystal, I am not simply leaving. I will utilize the atmospheric distribution vents of this very vault to seed a highly aggressive biological virus across the surface. Within exactly 72 hours, every living organism on Earth will liquefy, paving the way for a flawless, sterilized colonization. He was so intensely focused on gloating over his grand, genocidal strategy that his highly sophisticated sensory arrays completely ignored the mundane, manual labor occurring in the deep shadows behind the main console. Kalen's desperate surrender was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated theatrical distraction. Dominic was practically buried inside the gutted interior of the primary broadcast terminal. He was not tuning dials or attempting to hail military frequencies. He was viciously stripping thick, industrial-grade copper power cables with his bare hands, ignoring the searing pain radiating from his freshly burned palm. He forcefully twisted the raw, frayed copper wiring of the vault's main industrial power feed directly into the ancient amplifier circuits of the room's parabolic broadcasting array. He was completely bypassing all safety fuses and limiters, physically turning the acoustically perfect room into a colossal, raw resonance chamber. The commander's advanced analytical matrix finally registered the sudden, massive spike in localized electrical current. He snapped his gaze away from Kalen and locked directly onto the engineer. "You primitive fool," the commander snarled, raising his heavy subatomic disruption cannon directly toward Kalen's chest. "You cannot short-circuit crystalline shielding." "I am not trying to short your suit," Dominic roared, stepping out from behind the heavy console. He gripped his massive, heavily battered carbon steel wrench. He did not aim for the commander. Instead, with a brutal, full-body pivot, Dominic hurled the heavy metal tool violently across the room, throwing it straight toward the exposed, rapidly spinning turbine of the room's localized diesel generator. The solid steel handle smashed flawlessly into the rapidly churning mechanical gears. The heavy metal violently jammed the intake manifold. The immense steel turbine screamed in protest, locking up entirely in a blinding shower of bright orange sparks. Without the physical governor to safely regulate the mechanical output, the massive generator violently overspooled. It did not catch fire. Instead, the catastrophic mechanical failure forcibly dumped its entire stored electrical load outward in one single, violent push. A raw, unfiltered surge of 10,000 volts slammed directly through the makeshift copper splices Dominic had just woven together. The monstrous electrical current completely bypassed the radio transmitters and fed straight into the vault's vintage, analog emergency alarm speakers. The colossal vintage alarm speakers bolted to the walls of the parabolic chamber did not merely screech. They erupted with a profound, earth-shattering roar. It was a raw, unfiltered acoustic shockwave operating at exactly 10 hertz, a frequency so punishingly low that it was not just heard, but physically felt deep within the marrow of the bone. The sound wave instantly compressed and violently bent the air itself, turning the entire cavernous room into a devastatingly focused sonic weapon. The highly advanced crystalline matrix of the Vanguard commander's armor was an absolute masterpiece of flawless microcircuitry and rigid molecular perfection. But that absolute rigidity was its ultimate, fatal flaw. It was completely incapable of absorbing, bending, or dispersing brute physical resonance. As the 10 Hz bass wave aggressively slammed into his towering frame, the indestructible armor began to loudly hum, vibrating wildly out of sync with its own internal energy grid. The commander desperately clawed at his helmet, but he could not stop the basic laws of physics. The violent resonance peaked. With a deafening, crystalline shriek, the flawless synthetic armor catastrophically failed. It violently spiderwebbed, instantly shattering into millions of microscopic, glittering glass shards that rained down upon the rusted iron floor. The exact same devastating acoustic frequency tore straight through his subatomic disruption cannon, detonating its power core and reducing the terrifying weapon to useless, sparkling dust. The relentless 10 Hz frequency plummeted downward through the deep bedrock, violently shaking the tectonic plates. Far below, at the very edge of the churning magma vent, the delicate quantum components inside the commander's core resonator suffered the exact same catastrophic structural failure. Just seconds before it could trigger the massive volcanic eruption, the apocalyptic device violently short-circuited and completely died. The magma settled. The Earth was safe. Up in the communications room, the deafening alarm finally sputtered and faded into silence as the overspooled generator completely burned itself out. The commander stood violently shaking in the center of the room. He was completely stripped of his impenetrable shielding, his energy weapons, and his artificial strength. He was suddenly nothing more than a vulnerable, terrified flesh and blood soldier, standing in a very cold, dusty room. He looked down at his bare hands in sheer, unadulterated horror. Dominic stepped over the ruined metal grating, walking slowly and deliberately toward the shivering assassin. He did not draw a weapon. The engineer simply pulled his right arm back and delivered a brutal, unenhanced, purely human punch squarely to the commander's jaw. The heavy, visceral crack of bone, meeting bone, echoed loudly. The elite cosmic assassin instantly crumpled to the concrete floor, out cold. Silence finally reclaimed the subterranean vault. Kaylin wasted zero time. She rushed to the massive, archaic control board. She quickly integrated the raw data feed from the primitive memory crystal, fused to her spine, directly into the analog vacuum tubes of the shortwave transmitter. Digital Imperial sensors were explicitly programmed to block quantum data streams, but they possessed absolutely no defense against a broad-spectrum, low-frequency analog radio broadcast. "Transmitting now," Kaylin announced, her voice filled with fierce triumph. Her broadcast punched straight through the atmosphere, completely invisible to the blockade above, screaming across the solar system directly to the loyalist fleets hiding far beyond the outer planets. Exactly 3 days later, the scorching sky above the Nevada desert was violently torn apart. Massive, gleaming dreadnoughts of the true royal fleet descended through the clouds, casting shadows that stretched for miles across the sand. The Supreme Cosmic Court was utterly paralyzed by the ensuing political earthquake. Their invincible vanguard strike team had been completely eradicated, and their rightful heir had survived not through the deployment of advanced shielding or orbital strikes, but because of a grease-covered, deeply cynical human engineer operating out of a rusted, primitive concrete bunker. When Kaylin finally addressed the High Council, she did not simply reclaim her throne to rule according to the old, stagnant traditions. She issued her very first imperial decree, broadcasting her voice across the known galaxy. "The planet Earth is hereby designated as a sovereign, untouchable innovation safe zone," Kaylin declared with absolute authority. "They have proven that true resilience cannot be coded. They are strictly forbidden from ever being assimilated." As for Dominic Brockman, he flatly refused the pristine, tailored diplomatic suits offered by the royal emissaries. When he stood beside the newly crowned empress to sign the interstellar treaty, he wore his heavy, grease-stained canvas coat. Resting comfortably against his shoulder was his familiar, heavy carbon steel wrench. He was officially recognized across the galaxy as the first protector of Earth. A living, breathing reminder to the cosmic elite that no matter how sophisticated the technology becomes, the greatest power in the universe often lies in the mastery of simple physics and the unbreakable, stubborn will of humanity. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Sci-Fi stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.